Hi, my name is Roy and welcome back to Sacred Wild Man. Today's video is different from my usual content, which is focused on helping men end their own internal oppression so they can fully offer their gift to the world. Today's topic is not unrelated, however, it's a little bit more broad. And this presentation I first prepared for a consultation group, and since the feedback I got was positive, I figured I would share it with other people in the case it would be supportive and helpful to them in the chaotic time of 2020. So this presentation is titled Trauma in Meditation, Ego Death, and Suggestion. And it has been inspired by the existential crisis of 2020 that I have experienced within myself, and I imagine other people can relate to as well. Now, this presentation is not going to be about meditation. It is more so going to talk about trauma and how the experience of ego death is a common experience in trauma and meditation. And then I will attempt to tie the threads together with how this relates to the events of 2020 and how I have tried to center and ground myself in the midst of the chaos. So, although trauma and meditation might not seem like they bear any relevance to each other, I do see a commonality between the two. And that commonality is that both can lead to states of no-thingness or no mind. Basically, you have a blank slate. Now, how this happens via trauma is that when we experience overwhelming trauma, we are blasted out of our window of tolerance. Now, what that is a sweet spot. The window of tolerance is a sweet spot where we experience stress, but not too much, not too little, just enough that we are able to function at a high level. Now, when we go outside that window, we experience fight, flight, or freeze. Other people have also shared the response of fawn or fold. So the example of fold is just keeling over completely, and fawn would be the response where one desperately attempts to people please as a last-ditch effort for self-preservation. Now, all of these responses are also experienced during ego death. So ego, I define as your sense of self, who you believe you are and how the world works. Now, when that sense of self is threatened, then you are beginning to experience ego death. You're confused, you're disoriented, you're panicking, and your sense of self feels like it's going to dissolve. The same goes for meditation. People experience this ego death when they go into deep states of meditation. This doesn't happen initially because there's progressive states of consciousness when you're meditating. Initially, people experience the negative mind chatter that they just can't seem to stop. So it's kind of like the surface of the ocean or the edge of a hurricane. It's just very wild and chaotic. But as you go deeper into meditation, you go deeper into the ocean, where the water is more still, calm. You go deeper into the eye of the hurricane, where it is calm. And that's where people can experience a lot of bliss, but they can also experience that ego death, which can trigger a feeling of terror. Now, the difference between the two is that trauma-induced no mind results in fragmentation. The dissociation is the survival mechanism that kicks in, and the walls of amnesia come up to block out the pain and memory of what feels too overwhelming and horrific. With meditation-induced no mind, it is completely intentional. It is a conscious detachment, and you still have full memory recall, and even pain is felt. It is not blocked out, but it is felt, accepted, and allowed to let be or let go. And the state of no mind is very suggestible. This is the whole basis for hypnotic suggestion. Basically, this is where programming of beliefs or actions can happen. So you have positive affirmations. You can have affirmations that put into place certain actions that can be beneficial for you. But this can also go in the other direction to your detriment, depending on who is doing the programming and what the intent is. I include the quote, "I can't breathe," because it is relevant to the protests in light of George Floyd's murder. Now, I understand that the original intention of the chant is to protest the police brutality and the injustice of his murder. However, from a psychological standpoint, I am very curious about what impact that chanting "I can't breathe" while also wearing a face mask could have on the subconscious. So that's just something to think about. Now, all of this goes back to classical conditioning. You have your Pavlov's dog with the positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. You have your successive approximation, where you repeat positive reinforcers in order to ingrain a behavior or belief. You also have something called predictive programming, and this is a term that seems to originate from conspiracy theories. And the whole idea is that predictive programming is when conspirators put in media, so this could be movies, this could be music, they put in place ideas about events or perhaps a belief far ahead of hand. And the idea is that when it's put there, it's planted in the unconscious or subconscious of the public. And so when it actually happens in reality, people accept it passively rather than oppose it or resist it. This aspect of conditioning or predictive programming is present in advertisements and algorithms. So if you think about every click, every purchase, and your browsing history, you are providing a wealth of data to people who are collecting it. These advertisers and the algorithms know you better than you do. At this point, people have likely had the experience of potentially talking with a friend, talking about something you want to buy, and then just a few minutes later, when you're browsing your phone, up pops an ad that is related to what you talked about. Maybe it's the exact object that you wanted to buy, or it's something related. And it's rather creepy and uncanny when you think about it. Now, when we talk about all these advertisements, they are feeding us a consumeristic sort of desperation, that we need to buy more stuff. That what we never thought that we needed, suddenly we now think we need because we've been told we need it. This isn't just present for material, such as the latest tech gadgets, but it's also present for food. For example, Lay's chips or Pepsi. These aren't things that aren't part of the natural human diet. Pepsi and Lay's do not grow on trees, but thanks to very good advertisement, it is now part of the diet. Now, I include this quote just because I thought it was really funny. It says that some poor phoneless fool is probably sitting next to a waterfall somewhere, totally unaware of how angry and scared he's supposed to be. And this was just really refreshing because I think nowadays people, as much as we are integrated with technology, many are also choosing to unplug for certain periods of time, to go off the grid. I have many friends who have shared, I'm unplugging, I'm going off the grid, I can't take the amount of stuff that's going on in social media. And so it just goes to show everything is happening all at once. But when our attention is focused solely on one thing, you can feel like that's the only thing that exists in the world. So in 2020, with all the chaos going on, people might forget that there's also positive things going on as well. And so this quote is a good reminder of that. So the no mind experience taps into the subconscious mind. And this is important because the subconscious mind is a supercomputer in comparison to the conscious mind. It processes information way faster than the conscious mind. And this is what's responsible for you being able to perform so-called mindless tasks just seemingly on autopilot. Excuse me. Because once you learn how to do the activity or action that you're doing, you don't have to think about it anymore. because it has been programmed and encoded in your unconscious mind. So you could drive and have a conversation with someone next to you and still arrive safely at your destination. Now, the subconscious mind cannot differentiate between reality and fantasy. If you think about affirmations and hypnosis, the whole idea is you're bringing your mind to a certain wave state so that you can put in these more positive affirmations. And when you feel that these affirmations are true and you see them as if they are true, your subconscious mind can't tell the difference. And so people begin to live healthier lives with repeated positive affirmations in a hypnotic state. Now, some people might call that pseudoscience, but I think it's worth noting that science, if anything, has proven the power of the placebo effect, aka the power of the mind. When you think about drug trials of testing new pharmaceuticals, you have a control group that gets a sugar pill and you have a group that gets the drug that they're testing. Sometimes you have many people who are just on the sugar pill, a high percentage of them, almost even close to that of the pharmaceutical that's being tested. You have a close percentage of people who say just on the sugar pill they experienced an improvement in their mood. And so when you tell them that they were only given a sugar pill, many of them are surprised. And this example of the power of the subconscious mind and how it influences one's reality is also present in movies. For example, the movie Split, where James McAvoy plays a character with dissociative identity disorder. He has different alters. And when he goes into a specific alter, a specific personality with physical traits comes up. So one would be the alter that is a diabetic. It is only when he is in this alter that he becomes a diabetic. But when he's in any of the other alters, he does not have diabetes. Now, there's also the Imperius curse. This is a curse in the Harry Potter series. In the fourth book, Goblet of Fire, Mad-Eye Moody performs this curse on a boy named Neville Longbottom, who is very duck-footed and awkward. But when he's under the Imperius curse, he has no sense of self. His will is essentially under Mad-Eye Moody's full control. And so, whereas normal Neville might have no capacity to do amazing physical feats, under the control of Mad-Eye Moody's Imperius curse, he has no self and no mind limitation that tells him he can't do anything. And so in the book you'll read, Mad-Eye Moody has Neville perform these crazy acrobatics that he would otherwise be unable to do. Now, this ties into a slightly darker topic, and that is of ritual abuse and mind control. And I first learned about this in a class that talked about it in the context of religious cults. And these cults use tools such as gaslighting, sensory deprivation, torture, groupthink, or risky shift phenomenon. So a person basically sets aside their own individual will in order to go with a group. And this area of ritual abuse and mind control just illustrates how malleable the human mind is, especially for children, because they are at a stage where their mind, ego, and sense of self is not fully formed and developed. Now, how does this all tie into 2020 and the existential crisis that I shared about in the beginning? So far, we've had pandemic, we've had riots, both very chaotic things that have disrupted people's normal sense of life. Now, one can only question what's going to come next. Could it be a natural disaster? Could it be an alien invasion? At this point, I imagine many people, or just speaking of myself, anticipate that 2020 is going to continue to be intense. But all of this got me thinking. All of this we learned from the news. Because if we didn't have TVs or social media, we would be none the wiser that this is going on. So Then I thought of the question, if news didn't exist, would you know how you should think, feel, or behave? And if news is manipulated, what might be the payoff of having a population be in constant states of fight, flight, or freeze? Could it possibly be so that our minds become more open to suggestion? This reminded me of a class that I took on European history, where a professor shared a little anecdote about the Dark Ages and religious authorities being the ones in charge. He gave a funny example of a man who figured out how eclipses worked. And so what he did was waited for the perfect moment, told the people, I'm going to make a monster eat the sun. Now, if you don't obey and worship me, it's going to stay like this forever. But if you worship me, I will tell the monster to give the sun back. And so the people are terrified. They don't understand what an eclipse is or how it works. And so they keel over and say, okay, anything that you say, we'll worship and obey you. Just give us the sun back. So he waits a few minutes, the sun comes back, and now people see this man as a supernatural deity. This still happens in the modern day, for example, with religious authorities. You have your Bible thumpers who speak as the mouthpiece of God, who say that God's ways are greater than your ways, and so you must be obedient or else you are being sinful. This doesn't just happen with religious authorities, but it happens with other professions. You can have your medical experts, your scientists, and your politicians all saying that they have your best interest in hand. Now, if somebody goes to a doctor and they receive a terminal diagnosis, they could very well worsen their own health because of the diagnosis, because they see the doctor in such high regard that if the doctor says it's true, then it must be true. So, a hypothetical situation. Let's say a patient goes in because they want to get a polyp checked out. They're pretty sure the polyp is benign, but they just want to make sure. And for whatever reason, let's say the doctor has malintent. The doctor wants to make some extra money. So he goes ahead and performs an X-ray or whatever it is to examine the polyp. And then he presents a completely different X-ray from a completely different patient. And he shows the X-ray to the patient and says, so this polyp we found is actually malignant, and you need aggressive chemotherapy to treat it right away. Now, if the patient has completely put their trust in this doctor's diagnosis, then that patient will likely begin to manifest thoughts and feelings of fear, terror, doom, and worsen their own health, even though it's actually a benign polyp. So, some food for thought. Now, with all this chaos going on in 2020, I couldn't help but think of some movies, one being The Joker in Dark Knight, where he says, introduce a little anarchy, upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. And speaking of people, who normally we would like to believe were good people, he says, when the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other. And looking around at the current events, it's kind of hard not to admit that Joker is pointing something out that's pretty accurate. Another example of this is Captain America Winter Soldier. Zola gives a chilling speech where he says, for 70 years, Hydra has been secretly feeding crisis, reaping war. Hydra created a world so chaotic that humanity is finally ready to sacrifice its freedom to gain its security. Once the purification process is complete, Hydra's new world order will arise. And again, looking at the events of the world and how people are responding, regardless of whatever perspective, the way that people are reacting and treating one another really seems to illustrate both what the Joker and Zola have said. Now, the thing with chaos and disorientation is that there is great relief to being told what to do and having someone do it for us. This can either be positive or it can be negative. But seeing as how everything seems to be negative these days, let's look at it from the negative standpoint. Let's say somebody points to a boogeyman and tells us there's this terrifying boogeyman we need to worry about. We take their word, being terrified as we are, and cling to anything that gives us a sense of safety. Now, this is where meditation or Buddhist philosophy talks about attachment, and how attachment to our ego, our sense of self, is what creates these illusions of fear. We're so terrified, and because we resist this fear, we choose to not see, not hear, or not speak of it. We just want to feel safe. And in that desire to feel safe, somebody comes along and presents the solution for our benefit. They say that they have our best interests in hand. And in that terrified state, in that ego death, we take it because anything is worth the price of safety. Now, if this is done intentionally, then anybody can begin to mess around with people's sense of well-being. All it takes is somebody to spill the milk, create an accident, and people are terrified, and people are reactive. People are arguing and judging one another, paying attention to the milk that has been spilt. All the while, something else could be happening in the background, and people are none the wiser. This all goes to show that whoever controls the narrative shapes the perception. And whoever shapes the perception can then create in the general public feelings of fear, disorientation, panic, and all of this is overstimulating our amygdala, which is a part of our brain, though responsible for many different functions, is mostly referred to in its functions of storing emotions and memories, and how the amygdala is most often spoken about in regards to fear. And there's a good chance that the modern person's amygdala is much larger than it normally has been throughout history and is overstimulated. And this capitalizes on the inherent negativity bias that seems to be operating for the human race, which is us being hardwired to be biased towards giving more attention to the negative. So if somebody were to go out and interact with 100 people, and that person got 99 compliments and one minor criticism, maybe they didn't even say anything, they just gave them a dirty look, that person, and maybe this is yourself, I've certainly experienced it before, that person will go to bed that night thinking about that one criticism and ignoring the 99 compliments. So tying this all back to my personal existential crisis and perhaps the collective, with all the chaos that is going on, we can respond in a variety of ways. We can either fall in line, accept the general narrative because we're none the wiser and we feel that in our state of disorientation we need somebody to provide us the answers. Or you could respond by going alone. And that path requires a lot more entry into unknown territories, perhaps asking more questions and being able to handle unanswered questions rather than settling for answers that seem to make sense but may not actually be the right answers. And that's a decision each person has to make. They have to do a value judgment on their own. Do they value the illusion of safety and security, or do they value walking into the unknown and surrendering to the fear? If you choose to welcome the fear and surrender to the unknown, that will be a very scary process. It is one that I've experienced many times before, and despite those experiences, it isn't ever an easy decision to let go. But what I've learned is that oftentimes peace comes on the other side once you release resistance. You have to go into and through the fear in order to experience that peace. Now here's a simple example. Let's do a bit of imagination. let's say you're terrified of wasps and you don't want to get stung. In the first scenario, there's a wasp next to you and you really don't want to be stung. You're terrified of getting stung and you can hear the wasp buzzing next to your ear. How does your body feel? What sensations do you notice? Now we change to scenario 2. The wasp is still there, it's buzzing next to your ear, except this time you've accepted the fact that you'll get stung. You've accepted the fact that it'll suck, it'll hurt, but you know that you won't go into anaphylactic shock. You won't have a huge allergic reaction. How does your body feel now? What sensations do you notice? For myself personally, in the first scenario, my body is completely contracted and tensed up. Whereas in the second scenario, my body is less tense, I'm a little bit more relaxed, and there's a good chance that the more relaxed I am, the less likely I will actually be stung. Whereas the more tense I am, the greater likelihood that I might create that reality of getting stung. It's the whole idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, some reflection questions I've asked myself and want to present to you is, have you experienced yourself being suggestible consciously or unconsciously during the events of 2020? What practices do you have to maintain sovereignty over your own mind? And how do you work with the sensations of fear, terror, and uncertainty? And the last question is a little bit more of a joke about existential dread. But the point is, with all these reflection questions, it is introspective. It is going internally to do the work. James Hollis has this quote where he talks about externalizing what's internal. He says that what we do not understand in ourselves is projected onto our surroundings. And so the sum of our society is the aggregate of what is unconscious in each of us. So how does this apply to 2020? Let's say that the events of 2020, being as chaotic as they are, activate some part of you that is not yet healed, activates an unconscious wound, a place of pain and hurt. Now, if that hasn't been healed, it will suddenly be awakened. And what happens very often is that when we have certain things triggered within us, we will externalize it. We'll put it on somebody else and say that they're the source of the problem. So if you were to think of it just as using the example of sound, resonance, let's say the negative news you see on the media is loud pots clanking together. And there's a part of you that internally is also loud pots clanking together, but it's just been unconscious for a while. Now the news and that part of you resonate on the same frequency, the same sound frequency. This is the whole thing of resonance when you have people harmonize when they're singing. So now you have the external that's clanking pots and pans that activates your internal pots and pans being clanging. So now everybody in the whole world, 6 billion people, are pots clanking, and there's all this noise out in the world. This is what James Hollis is talking about. The sum of our society is the aggregate of what is unconscious in each of us. Now imagine if each person decided to heal that internal pain, to essentially resolve the pots that are clanking inside of them and turn it into something productive and healing. Now, it doesn't matter what's going on externally. They still have an internal sense of well-being. And so if everyone in the world did that, the situations would likely be very different. Now for the resources. One is called Emotional Freedom Technique, or tapping. If you go into YouTube and you type in Emotional Freedom Technique, you'll find plenty of videos that talk about this and teach this. And it's a helpful practice to help regulate the nervous system when you feel too overwhelmed. Another thing that can be helpful is a standing meditation. So I have a video of this on my channel. I also recommend you look into YouTube to find other videos on standing meditation, just to see what other people say. This is a practice I do personally, and it's been very helpful for grounding myself amidst the chaos. And there's also a free meditation that I've created called Eye of the Storm Meditation. You can find this on my website. The link is in the description below. All you have to do is subscribe to the newsletter and you'll get your free download link. And even if you don't want to be a part of the newsletters, you can unsubscribe right away and you'll still have that download. Now, as for books, I have a couple to recommend and also a few videos. So there's Vipassana Meditation by William Hart, The Untethered Soul by Michael A. Singer. These two books I have found very helpful in my own understanding of Buddhist philosophy and practice of meditation. There's also the video In Shadow, which is just a really beautiful art animation depicting somebody's perspective on what's going on in the world, how they see the human race living. And then there's Conformity, which is made by Vsauce, and he does some experiments which really capture the groupthink dynamic and how easily we can forfeit our own internal validation in order to feel validated by the group. Now, these last 4 books, you can pause to take down the name, but I'm just going to go through them quickly. These last 4 books are very difficult reads. There's no sugarcoating it. These books are very difficult to read. And the reason why is because they tap into that darker topic about ritual abuse and mind control. And these topics are something that the general public is mostly unaware of. So in my personal experience reading these books, it is almost like you are experiencing secondary or vicarious trauma. So the stories of the victims in the books, you almost feel as if you're going through what they went through. You feel the same feelings, emotions, and physical sensations of terror, helplessness, nausea, disgust, anger, a whole host of things. So these are intense reads and they're not for the faint of heart. If you do choose to read these books, my recommendation is to take it slow, take it easy. Some days you might only be able to read 1 page and you have to put the book down, taking a few days break or maybe even weeks before you read it again. And I would also recommend reading this book with some friends so that you can have somebody who at least understands where you're coming from and they have a point of reference. Otherwise, when you talk about this, you could have the response where people don't want to know, don't believe such things are possible. So those are the resources that I have for you. All right, that's all for today's video. I hope you found something helpful in today's presentation to support you in the intensity of 2020 and moving onward. Again, take everything with a grain of salt. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, feel free to toss it out the window. Ultimately, this is about you reclaiming sovereignty over your own mind and reclaiming your own power. And if my content has had a positive impact on your life, please consider making a donation on the homepage of my website or click the link in the description below. As I do create everything on my own, I receive any support with a deep amount of gratitude. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and remember that it is your birthright to have sovereignty over your own mind and every aspect of your life.